By the opening months of 1942, the United States faced an operational problem that was both measurable and immediate. German U-boats was sinking Allied merchant shipping in the Atlantic at a rate that exceeded replacement. The tonnage figures were reported weekly. They did not require interpretation. Ships were being lost faster than they could be built. The American response centered on standardized cargo vessels known as Liberty ships. The design itself was not new. It was adapted from a British model intended for rapid, economical construction. The urgency of the moment lay not in naval innovation, but in industrial capacity, how quickly hulls could be assembled, launched, and delivered into service. Along the American coasts, shipyards expanded at a pace unmatched in previous peacetime years. One of the largest concentrations emerged on the West Coast, particularly around the San Francisco Bay. New yards were built on mudflats and reclaimed shoreline. Facilities that had not existed before 1941 were now tasked with producing ocean-going vessels under wartime deadlines. In early 1942, a shipyard foreman at one of these West Coast facilities began his day as he had for months. His responsibilities were defined and limited. He supervised a section of the yard responsible for hull assembly, ensuring that assigned crews followed drawings, met shift schedules, and reported delays. He did not set policy. He did not attend strategic meetings. His authority extended only as far as the workers and tasks under his charge. The yard itself operated around the clock. 3 shifts divided the day. Welders, riveters, crane operators, and fitters moved across the slipways in steady patterns. Material arrived by rail and truck, steel plate, prefabricated sections, piping, and fixtures. The Liberty ship design emphasized simplicity. Parts were meant to be interchangeable. Construction steps were documented in manuals distributed across multiple yards. Despite these measures, progress remained uneven. Launch dates slipped. Completed hulls waited longer than planned for fitting out. The foreman's daily reports reflected a pattern that repeated across the yard, small delays accumulating into larger ones. The official explanations were familiar: labor shortages, especially among skilled trades, bottlenecks in steel supply, learning curves among newly hired workers, many of whom had never worked in heavy industry. Each factor was valid in isolation. Together, they produced a system that struggled to meet targets. The foreman's routine placed him at the intersection of design and execution. He walked the same routes each shift, checking weld seams, observing crane lifts, noting where crews paused or waited. These observations were not formal assessments. They were practical judgments formed through repetition. What he saw was not disorder, but inefficiency embedded in procedure. Sections of hull plating arrived at the slipway only after preceding tasks were completed. Crews stood idle while waiting for parts that were technically on schedule but not present when needed. Welding teams finished assigned seams and then moved elsewhere, leaving gaps that required later rework. Cranes were occupied lifting small components that could have been grouped or repositioned. None of these issues violated regulations. They followed them. The Liberty ship program relied on centralized planning. Drawings were issued from design offices. Production steps were sequenced to minimize risk and maintain quality. Changes required approval through layers of supervision. The system prioritized consistency over speed, a reasonable approach under normal circumstances. But the circumstances were not normal. Loss reports from the Atlantic arrived daily. Notices of sinkings were posted on bulletin boards or mentioned in briefings. They were not dramatized. They were presented as figures: ships lost, tonnage gone, routes affected. The implication was clear enough without commentary. The foreman did not receive these reports directly, but their effects were visible. Production targets increased, schedules tightened, supervisors emphasized compliance and output. There was little tolerance for deviation from approved methods. At the same time, the workforce expanded rapidly. Men and women arrived from across the country. Many had been farmers, clerks, or service workers months earlier. Training programs shortened to meet demand. Experienced tradesmen were spread thin, overseeing multiple crews. Under these conditions, small procedural inefficiencies carried greater weight. The foreman began keeping informal notes, not official logs, but personal observations. He marked where crews waited for materials. He noted how often components had to be repositioned because access was blocked. He tracked how many hours were lost to moving completed sections from one end of the yard to another. These notes were not part of any directive. They reflected a practical concern. Time spent moving, waiting, or redoing work did not contribute to completed ships. One recurring issue involved the sequence of assembly. Large hull sections were being assembled on the slipway itself. This meant that multiple trades had to share limited space. Welders waited while fitters installed internal components. Electricians waited while structural work finished. Each trade depended on the completion of the previous step. The alternative, assembling larger sections elsewhere and bringing them to the slipway ready to install, was known but not widely adopted. It raised concerns about alignment, quality control, and crane capacity. The official guidance favored incremental assembly on the hull. From the foreman's perspective, the slipway had become a congestion point. Too many tasks converged there, each dependent on precise timing. Another issue involved inspection. Welds were inspected after completion of specific sections. If defects were found, crews had to return to areas already closed off by subsequent work. This caused delays disproportionate to the size of the defect. The foreman did not question the necessity of inspection. He questioned its placement in the sequence. These observations did not lead immediately to action. The foreman understood his position. He was responsible for execution, not redesign. Raising concerns without a clear proposal risked being dismissed as complaint. Moreover, the yard's management structure emphasized adherence to established methods. Deviations were seen as risks to quality and safety. In wartime production, failure carried consequences beyond missed deadlines. Still, the gap between procedure and outcome widened. By mid-1942, the yard's output improved compared to its earliest months, but not at the rate required to offset losses at sea. Launch ceremonies occurred regularly, yet they did not keep pace with the numbers posted from the Atlantic. The foreman observed the effect on morale. Crews worked long hours. Overtime was common. Fatigue increased mistakes, which in turn required rework. The cycle was visible on the shop floor, even if it was less apparent in aggregate reports. He also observed something else. When informal adjustments were made, when a supervisor rearranged tasks to keep crews busy, when parts were staged earlier than scheduled, progress improved without noticeable loss of quality. These adjustments were minor and informal. They occurred within the margins of the system, but they suggested that the constraints were not purely material or labor-based, they were procedural. The foreman began discussing these observations quietly with other supervisors. The conversations were cautious. No one proposed defying orders. They spoke instead about coordination and timing. Some supervisors shared similar frustrations. Others warned against drawing attention. The prevailing view was that the system would improve as experience accumulated. Experience did accumulate, but losses continued. By late summer, the foreman's notes filled several pages. Patterns were clear enough to him that he could predict where delays would occur days in advance. He could see before a section arrived whether it would wait for a crane or block access for another crew. Yet prediction alone did not change outcomes. The yard's leadership remained focused on incremental improvement within existing structures. Training programs expanded, shift overlaps were adjusted, material delivery schedules were refined. These measures helped, but they did not address the underlying congestion. The foreman required him to submit daily summaries. These documents recorded hours worked, tasks completed, and incidents reported. They did not invite analysis of workflow design. There was no field for that. As autumn approached, the operational situation remained unresolved. The Atlantic campaign showed no immediate decline in sinkings. The Liberty ship program, while expanding, had not yet reached a level where production clearly exceeded losses. The foreman continued his routine. He walked the slipways, checked welds, and managed crews. His notes remained unofficial. His observations remained local. At this stage, there was no decision, no confrontation, and no directive. There was only the accumulation of evidence that the existing methods, while functional, were insufficient under the demands imposed. The workday ended as it had begun, with tasks unfinished and schedules revised. The foreman closed his notebook and prepared for the next shift,
aware that the problem was not a single failure, but a system operating at its limit. By the final quarter of 1942, the limits of the Liberty ship production system became harder to overlook. The figures arriving from Washington showed modest improvement, but the margin remained narrow. Ships were launching more frequently, yet sinkings continued at a pace that left little room for delay. The balance between loss and replacement shifted slowly, and not always in the desired direction. At the West Coast Yard, pressure translated into directives. Production targets were revised upward. Supervisors were instructed to reduce idle time and minimize rework. The language of these instructions emphasized discipline and adherence. The assumption remained that consistency would eventually yield speed. The foreman's section felt the change immediately. Overtime hours increased. Shifts overlapped more tightly. Crews rotated faster, often with limited handover. Fatigue became a persistent condition rather than an occasional concern. Under these circumstances, inefficiencies that had once been tolerable now carried visible costs. One recurring problem involved prefabricated components arriving out of sequence. Bulkheads, deck sections, and internal fittings reached the slipway according to schedules set weeks earlier. When upstream delays occurred, these components accumulated in staging areas. Space grew limited. Access routes narrowed. Moving large sections became more difficult and time-consuming. Cranes, already in constant use, were reassigned repeatedly to accommodate these shifts. Each reassignment required coordination and clearance. The result was a pattern of short interruptions that rarely appeared significant on their own, but collectively reduced productive hours. Inspection delays increased as well. As more ships moved simultaneously through the yard, inspection teams struggled to keep pace. Welds waited for approval. Crews moved on to other tasks, then returned days later to correct issues that would have been simpler to address immediately. The sequence of work became fragmented. These conditions were not the result of neglect. They reflected a system stretched beyond its original assumptions. The Liberty ship design had been intended for rapid construction, but the methods used to assemble it were still rooted in pre-war practice. Official responses focused on manpower. Recruitment drives intensified. Training programs expanded further. Instructional posters appeared throughout the yard, emphasizing proper technique and efficiency. These measures addressed symptoms more than structure. The foreman continued to observe the gap between instruction and outcome. He noted that crews often complied fully with directives, yet still lost time waiting for clearance, materials, or access. The problem was not effort, but flow. As production accelerated, the cost of rework became more pronounced. A misaligned section installed early could delay multiple downstream tasks. Correcting it required undoing work already completed by other trades. Each correction multiplied its impact. The foreman's notes now included estimates of lost hours. He tracked how long crews waited for inspections, how many times components were repositioned, and how often tasks were revisited. These estimates were conservative. They did not account for fatigue or diminished morale. The growing mismatch between reported progress and observed inefficiency created tension among supervisors. Meetings grew frequent. The The language remained formal, but frustration surfaced in the form of repeated reminders and tightened oversight. At one such meeting, production managers reviewed launch timelines. Charts showed improvement compared to earlier months, but they also revealed variability. Some ships progressed quickly, others stalled unexpectedly. The explanations offered were familiar: supply interruptions, labor turnover, weather. Rarely did the discussion turn to workflow design. When it did, it remained abstract. The foreman did not speak at these meetings unless asked. His position did not invite commentary beyond his assigned scope. Still, he listened carefully, noting how often the same issues were raised without resolution. Outside the meetings, informal conversations continued among supervisors. These exchanges were cautious but increasingly candid. Several supervisors shared similar observations on congestion on the slipways and delays caused by sequential assembly. One supervisor described an experiment conducted quietly on a night shift. Without altering drawings or materials, he rearranged the order of tasks so that internal fittings were installed earlier before certain hull sections were closed. The result was a smoother progression for that section with fewer interruptions. The experiment was not repeated openly. It had not been approved. The foreman recognized the pattern. When adjustments occurred within a single section, progress improved. When tasks followed the official sequence rigidly, delays accumulated. The difference lay not in resources, but in organization. At the same time, the cost of deviation remained high. Supervisors were reminded that unauthorized changes could jeopardize quality and safety. The Liberty Ship program emphasized reliability. Failures at sea would undermine confidence in the entire effort. This emphasis reinforced caution. Even those who saw alternatives hesitated to pursue them without sanction. The Atlantic situation continued to exert pressure. News of convoy losses circulated through official channels. The figures were discussed in general terms, but their implications were understood. Each ship lost represented not only material, but time, the one resource that could not be stockpiled. The foreman observed how this pressure affected behavior on the shop floor. Crews worked faster, but not necessarily smarter. Errors increased slightly. The margin for correction narrowed. Supervisors spent more time resolving conflicts over access and scheduling. The cumulative effect was visible in the foreman's daily walk. Where earlier he had seen occasional bottlenecks, he now saw persistent ones. Where delays had once been measured in minutes, they now stretched into hours. One particular hull exemplified the problem. Its assembly progressed smoothly through early stages, then slowed abruptly. A delay in installing internal piping blocked access for electricians. Their delay, in turn, postponed closure of deck sections. Inspection found minor weld defects that required reopening completed areas. Each step followed procedure. The overall effect was stagnation. The foreman documented the sequence carefully. He did not attribute blame. He noted only the order of events and the time lost at each stage. As similar cases accumulated, the pattern became undeniable. The system's linear sequence could not accommodate the volume and speed now required. Parallel work was limited by design, not by capability. The foreman considered whether these observations could be formalized. He reviewed his notes and reorganized them, grouping issues by type rather than by incident. Congestion, inspection placement, component staging, crane allocation, all appeared repeatedly. He stopped short of drawing conclusions. He understood that conclusions implied proposals and proposals implied authority. Still, the act of organization clarified the problem. Meanwhile, management responded with further measures. Shift schedules were adjusted again. Incentives were offered for meeting targets. Additional oversight was imposed on sections that lagged behind. These measures increased activity, but did not eliminate delays. In some cases, they intensified congestion by pushing more work into already constrained spaces. The foreman observed that the yard now operated continuously under strain. There was little slack left to absorb disruption. Any deviation, however small, propagated through the schedule. This fragility contrasted sharply with the simplicity of the Liberty ship's design. The ship itself was forgiving, the process was not. As winter approached, weather added another variable. Rain and wind slowed outdoor work. Temporary shelters mitigated some effects, but conditions remained challenging. Delays attributed to weather further obscured structural issues. Despite these obstacles, ships continued to launch. Each launch was marked formally, often with minimal ceremony. There was no shortage of effort or commitment. The question was whether effort alone could close the gap. The foreman's position remained unchanged. He supervised, reported, and adjusted within his remit. His notes grew thicker. His understanding of the yard's limitations deepened. At this stage, the problem had escalated from inefficiency to risk. Not a risk of immediate failure, but a risk that the production system would plateau below what the operational situation demanded. The tension between official doctrine and observed reality sharpened. Doctrine emphasized control, sequence, and approval. Reality emphasized timing, access, and flow. The foreman stood between these two forces, responsible for neither, but affected by both. He continued his routine, aware that the yard was producing more ships than before, yet uncertain whether it was producing them fast enough. By early 1943, the production environment at the West Coast Yard had reached a point where incremental adjustment no longer produced measurable gains. Output increased in absolute terms, but the rate of improvement slowed. The Liberty Ship program, conceived as an emergency measure, now operated under sustained wartime demand with little margin for inefficiency. The Atlantic situation reinforced this pressure. Although convoy tactics and air coverage had improved, losses persisted. Replacement remained a race against time rather than a matter of eventual adequacy. Within the yard, experience had accumulated unevenly. Some crews had worked together for months and developed informal coordination. Others changed composition frequently as new workers were assigned or transferred. Training shortened further, with instruction increasingly delivered on the job. The foreman's observations now extended beyond individual tasks to entire production cycles. He could trace the progress of a hull from keel laying to launch and identify where momentum stalled. The same phases appeared repeatedly as points of friction. One such phase was the transition from hull assembly to outfitting. As soon as a hull reached a certain level of completion, additional trades converged. Pipe fitters, electricians, and machinists entered spaces still contested by structural work. The sequence was defined on paper, but in practice, it depended on timing that rarely aligned. The foreman compared two recent hulls built to identical specifications. One progressed steadily, completing each phase close to schedule. The other, launched weeks later, experienced multiple stoppages. The difference lay not in materials or manpower, but in the order in which work occurred. In the faster case, several large sections had been assembled and outfitted away from the slipway before installation. In the slower case, the same work occurred after installation, under more constrained conditions. The design permitted either approach. The procedure favored only one. This contrast sharpened the foreman's assessment. The issue was not the Liberty ship itself, nor the workforce, but the insistence on a linear process where a modular one was possible. He reviewed his notes with this in mind. Instances where work had been completed in parallel, often unofficially, showed fewer delays and less rework. These instances were exceptions, not policy. The foreman recognized that articulating this pattern carried risk. Proposing a change in workflow implied a challenge to established methods. It also implied responsibility for outcomes beyond his formal authority. At the same time, continuing without change meant accepting known inefficiencies. The foreman weighed these considerations carefully. He did not frame them in terms of innovation or improvement. He framed them in terms of lost time that could be measured and reduced. The opportunity to act arose unexpectedly. A new hull was scheduled for assembly under tight constraints. Materials had arrived earlier than planned. Several experienced crews were assigned simultaneously. Weather conditions were favorable. For once, the variables aligned. The foreman saw in this convergence a chance to test his conclusions without drawing attention. He did not alter drawings or specifications. He did not ignore safety requirements. He adjusted only the sequence of tasks within his section, using discretion allowed to supervisors to manage daily operations. Large sections that would normally have been assembled incrementally on the slipway were instead completed more fully in staging areas. Internal fittings were installed earlier. Inspection points were coordinated so that checks occurred before access became restricted. These adjustments required coordination with other supervisors. The foreman approached them cautiously, presenting the changes as scheduling refinements rather than departures from procedure. Some agreed readily. Others expressed concern but did not object. The work proceeded under close observation. Crews responded positively, though not with enthusiasm so much as relief. Waiting time decreased. Movement across the slipway became more predictable. Cranes were used more efficiently. Inspection teams encountered fewer access issues. When defects were found, corrections occurred before subsequent work closed off areas. The sequence flowed more smoothly than usual. The foreman tracked progress carefully. He compared daily output against previous hulls. The difference was clear. Tasks completed earlier stayed completed. Delays did not cascade. At no point did the foreman present this as an experiment. He treated it as a response to scheduling realities. He remained within the bounds of his authority, though he recognized that the cumulative effect went beyond routine adjustment. As the hull advanced, the foreman prepared for scrutiny. Deviations, even minor, often drew attention once results became visible. He anticipated questions and reviewed his notes to ensure that every decision could be justified in practical terms. The hull launched ahead of schedule, not dramatically but measurably. The margin was small enough to appear incidental, yet consistent enough to be noticed by those tracking production figures. The foreman did not claim credit. He continued his routine. He made no announcement. His notes, however, recorded the sequence in detail. The response from management was muted. The launch was acknowledged as a positive outcome, attributed to favorable conditions and effective coordination. No immediate changes followed. Encouraged but cautious, the foreman applied similar adjustments to subsequent hulls when circumstances permitted. He did not insist on uniformity. He adapted based on crew experience and material availability. Results varied but trended in a consistent direction. Where parallel work increased, delays decreased. Where the slipway was treated as a final assembly point rather than a construction site, congestion eased. These outcomes did not escape notice. Production managers began asking how certain sections maintained momentum. The foreman responded factually, describing task order and staging without framing them as departures from doctrine. The risk, however, became more personal. As adjustments spread, the likelihood of conflict with established procedures increased. Quality control officers raised questions about inspection timing. Safety officers reviewed crane usage and load paths more closely. Each inquiry carried the possibility of reversal. The foreman understood that success alone did not guarantee acceptance. The system valued predictability. Any method that appeared to bypass formal approval invited scrutiny. Still, the evidence accumulated. Hulls assembled with greater modularity moved faster without evident loss of quality. Rework decreased. Idle time fell. The foreman now faced a choice. He could continue making quiet adjustments, accepting the risk of being overruled, or he could formalize his observations and present them upward, inviting evaluation and possible rejection. Either course carried consequences. Informal adjustment risked disciplinary action if interpreted as non-compliance. Formal proposal risked dismissal or delay if it challenged entrenched assumptions. The operational situation offered little time for prolonged debate. By the time spring approached, the foreman had accumulated enough data to support his observations. Whether or not he chose to present them, the pattern was clear. The risk was no longer abstract. It lay in deciding whether to remain within the narrow confines of his role or to extend beyond it in response to a problem that the existing structure had not resolved.
By mid-1943, the informal adjustments introduced on the shop floor had reached a point where they could no longer remain invisible.
Production records reflected a narrowing gap between planned and actual launch dates in certain sections of the yard. The improvement was not uniform, but it was consistent enough to draw attention from higher levels of supervision. The response was not immediate endorsement, it was inquiry. Quality control inspectors began requesting explanations for altered inspection sequences. Safety officers asked why crane usage patterns differed from standard allocations. Production managers compared schedules and noted that some hulls advanced with fewer interruptions than others. The foreman answered each question carefully. He avoided claims of innovation or superiority. He framed every explanation in operational terms: material availability, crew coordination, access constraints. He emphasized that all specifications were met and that no safety procedures were bypassed. Still, the pattern suggested more than routine variance. At a scheduled review meeting, section supervisors were asked to account for recent performance differences. The tone of the meeting was formal, but the underlying tension was evident. Wartime production left little room for ambiguity. Practices either aligned with approved methods or they did not. When the foreman was asked to speak, he did so without advocacy. He described what had been done in his section, step by step. He presented his notes, showing how task sequencing affected access and idle time. He did not recommend change, he reported observation. The response from management was cautious. Several officials acknowledged the data. Others questioned whether the improvements could be sustained at scale. Concerns were raised about consistency across yards and the risk of uneven quality. The prevailing view was that local success did not justify immediate systemic change. The Liberty Ship program operated across multiple facilities, each with different layouts, workforces, and constraints. Standardization was seen as essential to maintaining control. As a result, no directive followed the meeting. The foreman was instructed to continue operating within established guidelines and to consult before making further adjustments that might be interpreted as procedural changes. The message was clear enough. Initiative was tolerated only to the extent that it did not challenge authority. The foreman returned to his section aware that his margin for discretion had narrowed. He adjusted his approach accordingly. He no longer introduced changes quietly. He documented every deviation and sought approval where possible. This shift slowed progress. Requests for approval introduced delay. Explanations required meetings. Meetings required schedules. The very mechanisms designed to ensure consistency now consumed time that had previously been saved. At the same time, production pressure intensified. The strategic situation had begun to improve, but demand for shipping remained high. New operations in the Mediterranean and Pacific increased logistical requirements. The need for cargo vessels did not diminish with improved convoy protection. The yard's leadership responded by emphasizing throughput. Launch targets were reaffirmed, supervisors were reminded of their responsibilities. The expectation was that experience would continue to yield gains. The foreman saw a different reality. Without flexibility in sequencing and staging, congestion returned. Crews waited again. Rework increased. The improvements he had observed began to erode. This regression did not go unnoticed. Production figures reflected it. The contrast between periods of informal adjustment and periods of strict adherence became clearer in retrospect than it had been in real time. The foreman documented this as well. He did not argue causation, he recorded correlation. The tension between the system and observed outcomes sharpened. On one hand, centralized control offered predictability and accountability. On the other, it constrained the very efficiencies that the emergency demanded. The foreman was not alone in recognizing this. Other supervisors reported similar experiences. Some had attempted minor adjustments and been corrected, others had refrained from trying at all. These accounts reached higher levels gradually. They did not arrive as a coordinated critique, but as fragments, a delayed hull here, an accelerated one there, explanations that pointed indirectly to workflow rather than effort. The institutional response remained measured. Wartime organizations favored stability. Change, when it occurred, was expected to be deliberate and documented. The foreman understood that pushing further carried risk.
His position depended on compliance. He had no protection beyond his record. Yet the operational stakes remained. The data continued to show that certain methods reduced delays without compromising standards. Ignoring that data seemed increasingly difficult to justify. A turning point came in the form of external review. A team from a federal production agency visited the yard to assess output and identify bottlenecks. Such visits were routine, but their timing mattered. They arrived shortly after a period in which the foreman's section had reverted to stricter procedures and experienced renewed delays. The review team conducted interviews and walked the slipways. They asked specific questions about staging, inspection timing, and crane allocation. Unlike internal reviews, they compared practices across multiple yards. When they reached the foreman's section, he answered as he had before, describing both current practice and prior adjustments. He presented his notes again, this time as a record of operational variation rather than personal initiative. The reviewers listened without comment. They asked for examples. The foreman showed them 2 hulls built months apart, highlighting differences in sequence and outcome. He did not attribute cause explicitly. He allowed the data to speak. The review concluded without immediate feedback. Weeks passed. During that period, the yard continued under existing directives. Production remained steady but showed little further improvement. The foreman maintained compliance, documenting inefficiencies as they occurred. When feedback arrived, it came not as an order but as guidance. A memorandum circulated from the production agency recommending increased use of pre-assembly and parallel work where feasible. The language was careful. It did not mandate change, it encouraged evaluation. The yard's leadership interpreted the memorandum cautiously. Committees were formed to assess its implications. Pilot programs were discussed. For the foreman, the memorandum represented acknowledgement without vindication. The practices he had observed were now recognized in principle, but their adoption remained uncertain. As pilot programs were initiated, the foreman was asked to participate. His section was selected as one of several to test revised workflows under supervision. This formalization brought both opportunity and constraint. Adjustments were now sanctioned, but they were also scrutinized. Documentation increased, flexibility was bounded by reporting requirements. Still, the results were difficult to ignore. Under the pilot framework, larger sections were assembled and outfitted away from the slipway as standard practice. Inspection points were repositioned. Crane usage was planned in advance rather than assigned reactively. The effect on flow was immediate. Congestion eased. Idle time declined. Crews completed tasks in fewer passes. The data reflected these changes. Launch intervals shortened. Variability decreased. The foreman observed these outcomes with a measure of detachment. The practices were no longer his to manage informally. They belonged to the system. Authority response followed gradually. Reports moved upward. Comparisons were drawn across yards. The language of guidance shifted incrementally toward recommendation. For the foreman, the personal risk diminished as institutional backing increased. At the same time, his role receded into routine. What had once been discretionary became prescribed. The stakes peaked not in confrontation but in transition. The question was no longer whether the system could change, but how quickly it could absorb and standardize what had been learned. As the pilot programs expanded, the foreman returned to supervision under new guidelines. The work remained demanding, the pressure remained, but the alignment between procedure and observed reality improved. The foreman continued to document outcomes, though his notes now supplemented official reports rather than standing apart from them. The problem that had once seemed structural now appeared addressable. The resolution was not complete, but the direction was set. The system had begun to adapt, not through dramatic overhaul, but through measured incorporation of practices once considered unofficial. The foreman's role in this transition remained understated. He did not issue directives or claim authorship. He supervised work that increasingly flowed as intended. The operational stakes had driven the system to reconsider itself. The balance between control and flexibility shifted slightly, enough to matter. The next phase would determine how these adjustments shaped long-term production and whether their effects extended beyond a single yard.
By the end of 1943, the Liberty Ship program had entered a different phase. The urgency that had defined its early months did not disappear, but it became more structured. Losses at sea declined as convoy protection improved, while production continued to rise. The balance that had once seemed precarious now favored replacement over attrition. At the West Coast Yard, the pilot programs introduced earlier in the year were no longer experimental. Their procedures were incorporated into revised production manuals. Pre-assembly of larger sections, parallel outfitting, and earlier inspection points became accepted practice rather than tolerated deviation. The transition was not abrupt. It unfolded through memoranda, revised schedules, and training sessions. Supervisors were instructed not merely to increase output, but to manage flow. The language shifted from enforcement to coordination. For the foreman, this change altered the nature of his work without elevating his position. He remained a foreman, responsible for crews, safety, and daily progress. What changed was the system within which those responsibilities operated. Slipways grew less congested. Large hull sections arrived more complete than before. Cranes followed planned routes rather than responding to immediate demands. Inspections occurred earlier, when corrections were easier and less disruptive. The effects accumulated quietly. Launch intervals shortened. Variability between hulls decreased. The yard's output became more predictable, which allowed downstream operations, fitting out, trials, and delivery to align more closely with schedules. These improvements were recorded in reports that moved upward through administrative channels. They were discussed in aggregate terms, attributed to improved coordination, experience, and management refinement. Individual contributions were rarely named. The Liberty Ship program itself expanded beyond its initial scope. New variants were introduced. Other classes of cargo vessels adopted similar construction principles. The emphasis on modularity and parallel work influenced shipbuilding practices more broadly. Across the country, yards compared figures. Best practices circulated through official channels. What had once been local adjustment became standardized method. The foreman's notes were eventually folded into formal documentation. Some were copied into training materials as examples of workflow analysis. Others remained personal records, kept without expectation of recognition. He did not seek acknowledgement. The culture of wartime production did not encourage it. Success was measured collectively, in tonnage delivered and schedules met. By 1944, Liberty ships were launching at a pace that had seemed unattainable 2 years earlier. Some yards achieved launch times measured in weeks rather than months. These achievements were reported publicly as evidence of industrial strength. The foreman watched these developments from the same vantage point he had always occupied, the shop floor. He supervised crews that now included workers with years of experience. Training stabilized, turnover decreased. Fatigue remained, but it was managed more systematically. The operational problem that had once dominated his daily observations receded. Delays still occurred, but they no longer defined the process. The system had gained resilience. As production stabilized, attention shifted toward quality assurance and maintenance. The Liberty ship's reputation improved as construction defects declined. The emphasis on early inspection and reduced rework contributed to this outcome. The foreman's role in these improvements was indirect but real. He had not invented modular construction or parallel work. He had recognized where existing principles could be applied more effectively under pressure. His influence lay in observation and persistence rather than authority. When the war approached its final year, the yard's focus began to change again. Orders for Liberty ships slowed as other priorities emerged. Some facilities prepared to convert to peacetime production. Others anticipated closure. The foreman received notice that his section would be reduced. Crews were reassigned or released. Slipways that had once been crowded stood empty between hulls. The transition was managed with the same administrative care that had eventually characterized wartime production. There was no ceremony marking the end of the emergency. It arrived gradually,
through revised schedules and canceled orders. In the post-war period, the Liberty Ship program was assessed by historians, economists, and planners. It was cited as an example of rapid industrial mobilization. Statistics dominated these assessments: numbers built, average construction time, tonnage delivered. Less attention was paid to the incremental decisions made on shop floors and slipways, where supervisors and workers adapted procedures to meet demands not fully anticipated by planners. The foreman returned to civilian industrial work after the war. His experience placed him among many who had learned, under pressure, how systems behaved at their limits. He carried those lessons quietly into subsequent roles. He did not publish memoirs or seek interviews. His contribution remained embedded in processes rather than narratives. The shipyard itself changed. Portions were dismantled, others were repurposed. The mudflats reclaimed for wartime urgency returned to relative obscurity. The Liberty ships continued their service for years, carrying cargo across oceans long after the conflict ended. Some were scrapped, others were preserved as reminders of an industrial effort defined by necessity rather than spectacle. In retrospect, the speed at which these ships were launched became emblematic of wartime production. The figures were impressive, but they obscured the complexity beneath them. The foreman's story did not alter the course of the war by itself. It illustrated something quieter: how attention to process, applied at the right moment, could compound across a system. The production gains achieved were not the result of a single decision or invention. They emerged from alignment between design and execution, authority and observation, doctrine and reality. That alignment was fragile. It required willingness to adjust without abandoning standards. It required institutions to absorb lessons generated at their periphery. The Liberty Ship program succeeded not only because of its design or scale, but because it eventually allowed experience to reshape method. The foreman's role in that reshaping was uncelebrated but consequential. He did what his position allowed. He observed, recorded, adjusted, and persisted until the system could recognize what the numbers already showed. In the end, the ships launched faster not because Germany sank fewer of them at first, but because the American industrial system learned how to remove its own constraints. That learning did not announce itself. It accumulated.